For those of you who don't know me, I'm French Caldwell, Chief Evangelist at MetricStream, and I head up the marketing efforts here at MetricStream, Senior Marketing Officer. So I'm going to be moderating a panel here on Brexit. We have experts that are, I'm just amazed at the amount of talent we have here. Our goal is to sort of address the risk and compliance concerns and the impact that could happen with Brexit. As we saw before, some of the political aspects may come out as well, probably unavoidable. Now, here's how it's going to work. You're part of the panel, all right? The entire audience here is part of the panel. Our panelists on stage we're going to go across the stage. Each of the panelists will introduce themselves. They'll have 1 minute to do that. And they're also going to identify a key issue that is top of mind for them looking at the impact of Brexit from a risk or compliance perspective. So each of the panelists will introduce that key issue. At that point, remember panelists, 1 minute, Professor, 1 minute, okay, thank you. And we will all, and then once they've all introduced their key issue, I will turn to you and say to our panelists who are sitting here in the room, the rest of you, are there key issues that you would like to see the panelists engage on, or that you would like someone else in the room potentially that might have an opinion or a suggestion on that to share? So, but keep in mind, you two only have, I'm going to be a little unfair, you're only going to have 30 seconds to state what your issue is. The idea is not to go into depth on the issue at this point. It is merely to state the issue, a one sentence statement of the issue. At that point, once we've gotten all the issues on the table, I will turn to the panelists and we will begin the discussion on the issues. The panelists will expound further on the issues that they add. I may very well come back to you in the audience and ask you to expand further on an issue that you brought up. As my dad, who was an attorney, said, never ask a question that you don't have the answer to, all right? So I will come back probably to you, and we'll go back and forth like that for the next hour. At the end, I will ask each of the panelists to share one key takeaway. They will have 1 minute to do that, and I will ask the audience members to share additional takeaways, and that will conclude. And at that point, we should all have our pens and papers or our notepads out and be jotting down those key takeaways that we're going to take back to the office tomorrow morning and get to work on. All right? Everyone like the rules? These rules fair? Okay. All right. Who are our people with the microphones in here? John, are you, John Palmero, our head of European sales? Do you have a microphone? You need to get a microphone. And then, I want to be recognizable. Keep scanning the audience. I know some people, they're not quite sure they want to ask, whether they should ask a question or not. John, go to those people. If they look even remotely like they have a question, go to them. We're not going to do Q&A at the end. All right, Riza, where are you? Riza, where do you go? I thought we had one more here. Riza must be out solving a problem. He's good at whenever a problem comes up. Okay, so, all right. Now, we'll start. Sir Craig, we know who you are, right? Noel, would you please introduce yourself, and then we'll go right across and your issue.
Sure. Noel Harworth. I serve on a number of corporate boards in the UK. I've lived here 20 years and I'm a British citizen, so I participated in the vote. I'm giving you a very prosaic view as a corporate board director. As Sir Craig mentioned, Brexit is going to consume government. Don't let it consume your corporation, because what you need to be thinking about is setting up a Brexit project team. You need to set up governance around it. And you need to try to figure out how much this is all going to cost so that Brexit doesn't become the Y2K extravaganza for your company. I can get back to that later, but very prosaic, the need for project management skills in your corporation now around Brexit?
Thank you. Bill?
I'm Bill Durodie. I'm Chair of International Relations at the University of Bath. We've heard that politicians lie. Shock, horror. People evidently don't vote for truths, whatever that means. They vote for values. Where I come from, I'm concerned that 90% of academics, according to one survey, voted to remain, and that speaks of a cultural conformity in the academy that is not useful for this country going forwards. It's a university, not a monoversity. It's time we started having a debate about values and not childish gibberish about truths. And here's one of our politicians right here.
I sort of straddle both divides, having been in politics and academia. Well, I'm William Bain. I'm now in my third life as a head of Fintech, financial services, and the Brexit advisory unit at Inline Policy, a policy consultancy in London. And I think what I've been doing has prepared me for this moment perfectly, having been an academic senior lecturer in EU law for a decade prior to entering elected politics in 2009. I was elected as the Labour MP for Glasgow North East. I served as a shadow minister under both Harriet Harman and Ed Miliband, and I was one of the 40 Labour MPs in Scotland who lost amongst the tidal wave of nationalism after the referendum. My key point to you today is that Brexit is a process rather than an event. And yes, we may well be leaving the EU in March 2019, but the final shape of trading conditions and investment conditions for business will probably not be known until several years after we've left the EU. And I think an emerging point about the debate now is the need for a transitional arrangement as we leave the EU. And I think, as Sir Craig alluded to earlier, this concept that a final free trade and cooperation agreement is unlikely to be in place until several years after we've left the EU in 2019. So it's a process rather than just an event.
Thank you. Steve?
Yeah, good morning, everyone. I'm Steve Fowler, and I'm Evangelist for better business decision-making using sensible, people-focused approaches to risk and change management. You can ask me what that means later. Surely now is a time for enterprise risk management to stand up and do what it says on the tin. ISO 31000, the Global Risk Management Standard, defines risk management as a discipline for dealing with uncertainty, and uncertainty that matters. Brexit is certainly uncertainty that matters. The E in enterprise risk management tells us that we should look at risk holistically, whether that be across the corporation or across the country, not risk by risk. So don't focus on one thing, look at the holistic picture. We're looking at the holistic picture. What else is going on in the world? Climate change has hardly gone away. Resource scarcity will only get worse and will lead to more political battles, wars, if you like, around the world to deal with those sorts of issues. We're living through an unprecedented time of change. I haven't mentioned technology, and I probably shouldn't mention Gartner being at a MetricStream conference, but I'm going to mention Gartner. Gartner reckon that firms worldwide are going to spend $3.5 trillion on technology in 2017. Technologies like artificial intelligence, virtual assistants, the Internet of Things, which I describe to my son as our kettle, joining a botnet to hack into people's systems around the world, and augmented reality are all multi-billion-dollar businesses already. We're living in a world that is changing profoundly. Yet in Westminster, governments still talk about rebalancing the economy from services to manufacturing, just as the world is moving in the opposite direction. In this future world, and let's bear in mind that the biggest taxi company in today's world, Uber, has no taxis, the biggest retailer, Alibaba, has no shops, and the biggest hotelier, Airbnb, has no hotels. In this future world, collaboration is vital, as is having a ready source of skilled engineers to drive us forward in this world. Our approach to Brexit, whatever that might mean, must reflect this world, not the world of the monochrome 1960s.
Okay, thanks. So let's out to the panelists here on the other side of the stage. Does anyone have a key issue that you feel should be addressed by the panel or by someone else in the room? Anyone? Right now, now's the time to raise your hand. I will give you another chance. Don't worry, I will give another chance if you're not quite sure yet. And please state your name and where you're from, just so we have a context.
Hello. It's Piyush Pant from MetricStream. Just a question around the nature of the changes in the media, because I think Craig earlier referred to people having skepticism of authority and misleading campaigns. And I wanted to kind of invite comment on the nature of direct access to different kinds of media by the electorate and the wider community, and the effect it actually has and the implications on how campaigns and similar sort of engagements in the future should be led, given the world that we're living in, which is not based on media going through a neutralizing filter before it actually reaches the audience. So there's limited fact checking, there is limited scope for dilution of messages, and potentially the opportunity to mislead.
Thank you, Piyush. Anyone else at this point? Yes.
It is with regard to the tactics in negotiating with Europe. One side favors the approach, we don't tell anybody how we are going ahead. It's all secret, that's the best way of getting results. Others say it has to be scrutinized in Parliament and everything has to be discussed. So which way forward is the right thing? And personally, I think in a war, if the generals discuss publicly on the TV what the next step should be with how to attack the enemy, I think that war might get lost. So my opinion is that it should be done in secret.
Okay, thank you. All right, so let's, do we have one more? Do we have one more right now? Right over here.
I suppose one take-home message of the referendum, and it's the repercussions we're still seeing recently with the attacks on the judges' ruling on Article 50, is how do we restore faith in parliamentary democracy and the rule of law? And how do we move past this bizarre fixation with popular democracy, which has never really been a cultural thing in the UK?
Thank you. Thanks, Michael. Okay, so let's start here, a little bit. I want to come back a little bit to sort of maybe some of the less political aspects, then maybe go on to the political and come back once again to the less political. So we'll have a political sandwich. Is that all right? Okay. So we talked here, Noel, I think you had talked about potentially a team. Could you maybe expand a little bit on that, how you've seen that work before maybe in other periods of crisis?
Well, certainly. I mean, I used Y2K as an example because Y2K was a gigantic exercise that was conducted, which cost probably billions in terms of expenditure by corporations. But when I mean a team, I think what's really important, and I'm looking at this through the prism of my companies, is to avoid the diversion that Sir Craig was talking about that's going to go on in government, where everybody is working on Brexit. Businesses need to make money. You need to be keeping people focused on your core strategy in the business, and Brexit probably isn't it. Set up a team and project manage it. Get one person that's the head of the team, allow them to assemble people around them that are going to be working on the various project streams in the company. Give them a budget so they can hire the consultants now that they're going to need, because believe me, in 2 years' time, those consultants are going to be pretty picked over and there may be nobody left to hire, which is what happened in Y2K. So I'm encouraging you to try almost to isolate Brexit as a project work stream in the company so that it doesn't become a total distraction and it has a governance arrangement around it. Because I think the risk that you have is that there are going to be chickens running all over the place, and pretty soon nothing is going to get done, and you're going to spend a huge amount of unproductive time and money.
Anybody else have anything to say on that?
I agree completely with what Noel's just said. If we were looking at Brexit as a project, and some people have done this retrospectively, then what's the first thing that we'd want to do? We'd want a clear project definition workshop to agree the scope of the project. Somebody tell me what the scope of Brexit is. As far as I can see at the moment, it hasn't been defined on a national or international basis. We'd want a precise finish line. You know, let's remember, those of us who are old enough to remember, President Kennedy stood up at the beginning of the 1960s and said, put a man on the moon by the end of the 60s, precise finish line. And we'd want a charismatic sponsor. Now, nationally, the two charismatic sponsors we had for the Leave campaign, Johnson and Farage, seem to have run away. If you look again at the USA, the only way that Obama got the healthcare reform bill through was through his own force of personality. Now, we can't do anything about what's done in this country, but each of us can do something about Brexit as a project within our own firms. And the first thing I'd do, if I were you, is set up a proper project definition workshop with all the right people in the world, all the right people in the room, probably all the right people in the world in the room, and get someone to take ownership. Otherwise, it's going to be a mess.
Now, this is a question I want to ask. I don't want to answer right now, all right? So, you know, going back to my analyst days at Gartner, so, you know, when we would do scenario analysis for tricky issues like this, we would, you know, pick sort of two axes, and you'd end up with 4 potential future scenarios. So if we looked and said one axis, and everyone out here in the room think about this as well, if you're looking at the future, one axis is hard versus soft Brexit, all right? What would the other axis be that you would use to develop a future scenario for Brexit? And there could be many, but just think about that for a while. But anyway, I'll come back to that. Bill.
Well, I think we forget at our peril where authority actually comes from. And nation states were built by the people, for the people, held to account to the people. A member state, on the other hand, is a member of a club that hold each other to account to some supposed higher moral order that nobody gets to engage and debate. And more importantly, they tend to view people as problems, risks to be managed. So we've gone from people being the agents of their own destiny to people simply as things to be pushed around by those who know better than them what's good for them. And I think, you know, that also emerges in this debate about parliamentary sovereignty, because ultimately, whilst it is true and good and healthy that we have a sovereign parliament, the authority of parliament derives from the popular will, ultimately. It's very rare that it's put to the test, but it can be put to the test. And I think, you know, the irony here that I'm listening to is that having voted, 17.5 million people are pushed into the background. They're not part of the solution. They're not part of the discussion about what do we now need to, you know, suddenly it's been claimed again by people who are going to project manage the process and walk back into the same trap that half the population of this country have indicated they don't want to be part of. And I think that, you know, hard exit, soft exit, that's all part of the discourse of people who simply don't accept the vote that was put in place. If you want to leave the European Union, Lord Kerr, who wrote Article 50, points out if you want to leave a club, stop paying the fees, don't show up, they'll work out that you've left.
Surely you're not suggesting that corporations, we're in the business to make money. We've got to organize our affairs in an appropriate way. We can't simply sit on our hands and say, oh, let the will of the people take its toll and we'll see how it's all right on the night. I mean, that would be completely irresponsible at the corporate level not to start viewing Brexit as a reality and start planning for it.
Right. You know, Noel isn't. I mean, what I'm kind of hearing here from Bill is that the biggest issue here is uncertainty. Our people here in the room, the attendees, all of us, everyone in this room we're responsible for helping our organizations manage through uncertainty. That's what risk management is all about. So if you just say, hey, we're quitting paying the dues, we're out tomorrow, there is no more uncertainty from a political standpoint, but there's still a lot of corporate uncertainty. Yeah, right?
This is the first political debate we've had in this country for a generation, really since Margaret Thatcher, that suddenly people at work started talking to one another about politics. People in families started falling out over politics. I actually think it's a really healthy moment, and we ought to capitalise upon that rather than become hysterical about the outcome and say we can't handle it. Half your employees, presumably, voted Brexit. And so you need to begin to talk about what it was that they identified in that project that you can draw on.
I think I would just say to you, Bill, I don't think anybody's caricaturing your position as ridiculous. So I think you need to stop caricaturing everybody else's position as ridiculous. All people are simply doing is saying this presents us with a major issue and we need to work out a way to deal with it. Let's not fight the referendum again and all the arguments on it. We have a reality, we all accept the situation, what's the best way to deal with it? And if you keep dragging it back into a caricature of this kind of establishment where experts who don't know what they're talking about and the establishment's against the people, we're not going to get anywhere, and the final 33 minutes of this discussion will just end up nowhere.
Can I do something maybe people don't expect of someone who's been an MP and maybe address the specific questions? We have this terrible reputation of not answering questions, those of us in politics. Firstly, on the issue of the media, one of the biggest transformations in the last 10 years has been the contestability of the mainstream media. And it was felt very much in the referendum campaign, in the Scottish referendum campaign hugely as well. And I think it's now fed into politics, not just in Europe, but in the United States. I mean, you know, look at what's happened in the presidential campaign. You know, you have one of the candidates taking on one of the networks, you know, some of the journalists from some of the networks, which might be supporting him in terms of sort of Fox News and some of the interesting things Donald Trump said about individual journalists in Fox News. You've got social media now acting as an amplifying chamber for those who agree in the same things. And that makes, I think, dealing with political campaigns really difficult, because trying to break through beyond the Twitter and Facebook shells that people now inhabit and communicating messages to undecided voters is increasingly difficult. I think we've seen a further development in this US presidential campaign of the use of social media. I mean, in the last 24 hours, I mean, some of the sort of short clips that the Democrats have been putting on are incredibly slick, incredibly powerful. They're there to generate emotions, to say to people, right, get to the polls, I am going to vote today. And I think that we in Britain and in Europe collectively have probably got a lot to learn just in the way that the Democrats have used social media, in this electoral cycle. And it will influence what happens in our next electoral cycle. On the question of the negotiations, look, let me firstly take issue. We heard the word enemies being used. I mean, look, the people in the EU 27 have been our partners for decades, if not centuries. They will be our partners in Europe for decades, if not centuries. We may not be in the political and economic entity that is the European Union, but we are still European in Britain. And we're not going to stop being European in Britain. And we're going to cooperate with them and trade with them and, achieve great things together. In terms of the process, look, we know in the European Parliament, it has a powerful role in scrutinising what the Commission is going to do. The Commission will negotiate on behalf of the 27 EU other member states. And the Commission, the Parliament will publish documents, right? I mean, if you look at what the chair of the Constitutional Committee in the European Parliament said last week, when we get stuff, it's going online, we're going to publish it. And that's the way that part of the TTIP process went midway through the discussions. So, for us in Britain to have to find out some of the issues around our negotiating position from the European Parliament is unacceptable. And I think there is a middle way between having, complete declarations of every single document and every single part of every single meeting that will happen in Brussels and having nothing. And I think it is possible for the UK government to ensure that Parliament can be well enough involved to scrutinise what's going on without giving away, what the ultimate bottom line is as we get towards the final months of this negotiating process. So I think it is possible to do that. And no, the EU27 are not our enemies, they're our partners. On the issue that Michael raised about, the rule of law, the independence of the judiciary, this, for me personally, is one of the most insidious things. That, you've now got a situation where populism, and that's what this is, said the enemy is Europe. You've then got a situation where now people turn and they're looking for enemies within Britain. So it's now judges, it's now individual MPs expressing individual views. What's coming next? This is a very dangerous force. It's dangerous for business, it's dangerous for societies, it's dangerous for politics, and we've got to push back on it absolutely clearly. Look, I used to do constitutional law lectures saying, look, everybody believes in the rule of law, don't they? Everybody believes in the independence of the judiciary. Now we've got a society where these things could be coming under threat, and we've got to push back against it and say, look, a decent society is one where I may not agree with the judge's opinion, but I respect it. I respect it. It is a society where, you say, well, I might not agree with what my own MP is doing, but I respect his or her ability to do that job. As Edmund Burke said once, we elect MPs as, representatives, not just as delegates. And I think it would be deeply damaging if we move down a scope to further populism in the UK. That would not be the proper response to the referendum.
Okay, let me try to just bring this home for some of our attendees here who are looking at all of this argument around populism versus institutions and so on. We all belong to some level of institution, whether it's our company, whether it's our industry, so on. So are there any of our attendees here who have already taken steps to manage through the uncertainty associated with Brexit? Has any of your companies here taken a step? Would you care to share that? Can we...
There we go. It's quite encouraging to hear some of the comments because where we've gone in EDF Energy is to set up a distinct project team to look at the Brexit issues, the potential Brexit issues, and I think we are managing to keep it at the level it needs to be at. It's obviously discussed at high levels. We're looking at what action we need to take, what scenarios could occur. But it's not taking over the whole business at the moment. So it is quite pleasing to hear the comments from the panel.
Okay, very good. We had somebody else. Did you have a question? Anybody else here?
No, I was just indicating that we had
go ahead.
So I'm from Zurich Insurance. As we all know, Zurich, background is Swiss. So even though we are out of the EU in terms of the head office, we've got companies all over the world. And one of our stances is to say that irrespective of what the outcome is, Zurich will remain in the UK. So from a head office standpoint, we've got a team in place that is monitoring the Brexit event and trying to prepare, and that's what we're doing, trying. Nobody knows. It's like the unknown. We don't know what's going to happen. But aside from that main team in the head office, we've also got sub-teams all over, like different countries, waiting and watching. For UK, for instance, I am responsible from my small team to see what the impact of that is, because I monitor outsourcing governance. So what does that mean for us, our third parties, our suppliers? It's just kind of trying to anticipate what that could mean for us and how well we can prepare.
Yeah, so what I'm hearing is part of what what Zurich did to bring some certainty into an uncertain period is to say, here is a statement of principle that we will stay in the UK, right? So everybody now has at least one one solid point that they can grab hold of and then make decisions around that. That's good. So we have a team, establish some key decision-making principles. Anybody else have anything out here? Okay. Craig, I want to come back to you because you were asked a question on some of the lessons learned. If you were to go and say, all right, let's take the government that you served in, right, and said, all right, let's now, instead of a government, that's a business. And you were buffeted by some public policy issue, and we see this all the time. We saw airlines that were buffeted by Cecil the Lion concerns about bringing hunting trophies home. We have banks that are buffeted by things like rules around foreclosing on people when the owner of the mortgage dies. And there's all these public policy issues out there that each of our industries deals with, and we get hit by these in social media, and social media is a populist medium by nature.
I think,
right? So what would you, if you were in a business, what are the lessons learned from dealing with this sort of direct social media challenge?
Well, look, the reality is there's a danger that you think that everything has shifted towards social media and that the world is now a social media world and that all your energy and effort should be focused on that. In fact, the reality is the mainstream media is as powerful as it's ever been. And look at what happened in the EU referendum, the impact of newspapers, very, very strong impact there. The BBC news bulletins, they've got a reach of about 30 million people in this country. The mainstream media still has a huge amount of power and needs to be focused on. What I think it does have in common is that things have speeded up in terms of covering stories. So that the deadline is not just the next news bulletin or the next day's newspaper, it's the time it takes somebody to write a tweet. And the result is that the pressure on government and the pressure on business to react and respond quickly, it's gone up exponentially. So the reality is, don't panic, establish the facts quickly and communicate them quickly, but don't jump in immediately before you are absolutely sure of what you are saying and the message that you want to get across. You do need to react quickly, but you need to do it in a way that you are clear and strong. And the one thing I was just going to say was we've seen a very good example in the last week of how an issue can explode and everybody starts running around and setting their hair on fire and people on the Remain side say extreme things and people on the Leave side say extreme things on the High Court decision. What actually happened there was the judges interpreted the British Constitution as saying that Parliament has to have a say. You cannot change the law of this country without Parliament. And I suspect what will happen is very few MPs will vote against Article 50 because they know it would be electorally suicide for them to do so. It is not a smart thing to go against that. It is not a good look. So I suspect in a few weeks' time when the Supreme Court makes its ruling and when Theresa May reacts, we'll look back at this time and go, wow, that was crazy. Everybody was shouting and screaming and going mad, but actually it turned out to be something that just passed very quickly. And building on what Noel was saying, I think is that unit, which is isolated in your company, try and establish what the reality of that situation is. What was the reality of what the judges were actually doing? And separate that out from all the political points that are being made around it and what influence of that happened. And I think you'll find, in terms of the judge's decision, this will pass quite quickly. It won't be seen as a major point in the road towards Brexit. But we just had a week of screaming headlines and everybody going crazy.
Right. So, Bill, I want to ask you the same thing. Go ahead.
Again, taking a corporate perspective on current media, digital media, what is happening from a corporate perspective is truth and lies have equal weight in the media. And you can float truth out there, and that gets the headline. Lies get equal headline. You've seen that in the American election. Complete whoppers being told. Same thing with the EU referendum. Doesn't cut it for me in the boardroom. What you need is to get the facts, as you know them, as Craig is saying. What are the facts that impact your company? The rest is noise. And I think that you got your Brexit committee or your Brexit project group needs to siphon out all the detritus, focus on the facts, because that's the only thing that counts. The lies, the truth, equal weight in the noise, forget about them.
You know, the challenge is I worked for one of the best analyst firms in the world, frankly, you know, and I found that extraordinarily good analysts on topics from which they are expert, the moment they get into anything political, it seems like they lose all their analytical skills. So, I mean, Brexit is almost inherently political.
Just very quickly, be prepared to wait, because politics doesn't necessarily follow a timetable. Lots of people want to make a decision and demand something now. So when I was in number 10, I used to go through the underpass from Westminster Tube Station to come out the other side of Whitehall. And 1 month there were Gatwick adverts, and the next month there were Heathrow adverts, and the next month there were Gatwick adverts, and the next month, and they were trying to influence people in Whitehall. And I kind of wanted to ring them up and say, you guys, you're wasting your money. The government is not ready to take a decision on this for at least a year, and that's because of the politics of this is very complicated and it doesn't follow the rules of business. So, you know, stop spending money on this now, because, and I think you can apply the same to Brexit, is wait until you know. Wait until you know what is actually going to happen as a result of things. Don't try and take decisions now and think, our strategy, this is the road we must take. Because the government doesn't know what road it's going to take. It's waiting for information.
Well, a lot of our attendees here, though, are chief risk officers at banks, and they're almost required to go out and do stress testing against future scenarios. So, in a way, they have to at least come up with a few possibilities.
By all means, work out what are the possibilities, but don't take decisions on something that you don't know yet. It's Donald Rumsfeld. You know, don't try and take those decisions before you know the facts.
Right, yeah, well, they're the known knowns, right? Known unknowns.
And unknown unknowns.
But the trick is taking those unknown unknowns, and that's where stress testing and scenario analysis comes in, and teasing out things that are truly knowable, you know, from those, and to shrink those unknown unknowns down to as small a piece as possible. I want to come back to Bill, though, because I want to ask you the same question. You know, I know it's sometimes a challenge coming from a different industry, but try and get in your head inside the minds of a banker or a manufacturer and say, all right, this issue that you bring up of cultural conformity, what would be the impact of cultural conformity inside, say, you know, a large manufacturer? You know, what would be the challenge there from a corporate culture perspective? What are the risks and the dangers from this cultural conformity?
Well, one of my concerns from a kind of political perspective is that we're increasingly moving into an age where people do not say what they think for fear of causing offence, for fear of being challenged. They listen and read echo chamber media and get confirmation bias, as pollsters do. You get Democrats in America saying, I've never met someone who's going to vote Trump. You kind of think, well, you should get out more. And this culture of conformity also leads to a culture where people act in bad faith pretty much all the time. So government increasingly introduces legislation to be seen to be introducing legislation, to be seen to be addressing terrorism. We have the prevent duty that anyone in Whitehall would quickly say cannot possibly work, but at least we're seen to be doing something. And universities are being seen to implement it because they know who pays their bills. And I think if you're a young person, you actually want to believe in something and belong to something. And if all of your major social institutions around you and the businesses that you're surrounded by are basically going through the motions for fear of engaging in debate, for fear of, you know, and in order to be seen to be doing things, it's not particularly appealing or attractive. I thought it was the role of government to lead, not just to wait until the outcome kind of emerges. And I think, you know, I apologize if I'm coming across a little bit strong, and it's not because I want to caricature someone else's position or re-fight a battle that happened several months ago. It's because I sincerely believe you haven't yet understood why the vote happened. You know, when people talked about immigration, for instance, that's not really what they meant. We're not living in the 1970s when people at school in West London, where I was, would say, we're going out packy bashing on Friday, do you want to come and join? We're not living in that world anymore. What people meant was, We're concerned about resources and levels of amenities, and we'd like to have a say in that. But of course, they're using the language of the past sometimes in a not too sophisticated way, and it doesn't help them. But you need to dig beneath what people are saying and get a grip on why there was that level of support to get out. And I think it's not because people were sucked in by the lies. People didn't believe that they would be better off. I think, most people understood, by the way, that it was equally a lie to say that we would be £4,300 worse off per annum if we voted for Brexit. Facts are contextual and partial, so you can't just appeal to the facts. You have to identify what your values are, what your principles are, where you're going to be. If you want to be resilient, it's not about buying kit. It's about knowing who you are, what you stand for, and where you're going. And unfortunately, we're living in an age when most politicians can't answer those three questions.
Let's go back out to the audience here.
Yeah, and I have a question I think that relates very closely to what's just been said there. I think, from my point of view, the biggest elephant in the room that it seems to me to be is this trust deficit that exists and that has been shown up through both the Brexit referendum, and you can say probably exists in the American elections, the rise of populism and the rise of the right across some of Europe. Is that not the biggest unaddressed risk? At the moment is how do you close the trust gap? How do those in power show themselves to be trustworthy in a way that helps to address that problem?
William, you want to address that?
Thanks. It's a really interesting and profound question because it affects our living standards, it affects our economy. I think it's true to say that after the financial crisis, we've first of all had a crisis of trust in the financial sector. That spread to politics through the expenses crisis, but it's far, far deeper now, far deeper. The level of cynicism that one encountered in the two referendums that I was involved in the general election campaign, I think it is very corrosive, not just of politics, but of society. And it's reached a new level in the United States, of course. But I think where this affects the economy is we're now starting to get globalization itself, the global movement of investment and capital, now being increasingly questioned. We had a very protracted process to get CETA signed. We were all following what was going on in Wallonia with huge interest. I think in terms of TTIP, it's not looking good for successful conclusion of those talks. And I think the reason that this affects us is we're now seeing the increase in global trade going into reverse. If you look at last year and this year, the growth that we've seen that makes people better off is slowing, is falling. And the worry that I have is that lack of respect for institutions means that business itself is threatened because we don't have that investment in each other's countries, the exchange of ideas, the development of new business models that is necessary for us to get the growth that will make us all prosperous in the end. I think there was a really good point just a few minutes ago about, what is the point of business engaging with this process? Because there are so many unknown unknowns. There's a huge point, I think, in helping to shape this. I deal with a lot of companies who are in the manufacturing side, who are very worried about what it would mean for the UK to be outside of the customs union. What does it mean for an exporter to have to produce 50 pages of paperwork when they want to sell their goods into France or into Germany? What's it going to mean to face potentially extra charges for doing so? So these are all issues where the government position is not decided. The government has to take a decision on this, and this is the perfect time for business to go in and get its voice heard. On financial services, I think it's very much not just the passporting issue that's been well ventilated. I think it's also this idea about having transitional protection. We know that a free trade agreement could take as much as 5 years to negotiate after we leave the EU. Having that transitional protection in place is critical for an economy like ours. 79% services in Britain.
Steve, I'm sorry, I might have to go. I think we had one more from the audience right over here, real quick. And then I'm going to ask everybody to think about their key takeaway, and we're going to wrap this up. So, by the way, on the issue of trust, when it comes to your industry, go take a look at the Edelman Trust Barometer, find out what level of trust there is in your industry in the UK. And just keep in mind, you only have to be 1 point higher than that. Okay.
Yeah, actually, I have a very quick question for Bill on what you said earlier, because I thought it was quite interesting that you pointed out this culture of conformity and need to belong, and reinforcing your beliefs through the echo media. I mean, I think you pinpointed something or an issue that still does exist and still exists, but I would like to have your opinion on how that works on a corporate level, because in financial services we have the same problem, had the problem, still have it in terms of decision making in the boardroom, in committees, and so on and so forth. So I'm just eager to see if you have at least a solution or an idea of a solution of how you would combat that kind of culture.
Noel, do you want to?
I think that the boardroom is an interesting place, and certainly from a political standpoint, my fellow board members are both Remainers and Leavers. And so I don't think politics has a room in the boardroom at all. I go back to what I was saying all along. I think in a corporation, you need to forget about the politics. Brexit is happening. It now becomes a project. You put your head down, you figure out how it's going to get done. I have great sympathy for the professor, and we should all be thinking about what this means in the greater geopolitics of Britain. But as far as I'm concerned, doing my role as a board director, I could care less. It's now a project and a program that we need to deliver for our companies. And we need to make sure we de-risk it as much as we can, both in terms of cost and in terms of digression from what the strategy of the business is. That's it. That's what a board is there for. The politics are something you talk about at cocktail hour or at dinner after the board is met. Has no place in the boardroom. I don't know if that answers your question, but.
Steve, why don't we start? I want to start here with you, and just state 1 minute a key takeaway, an action item for people who are going back to the office.
Okay. Well,
tomorrow.
This actually builds on the last question. In my experience, in a corporation, trust is driven by strong leadership that recognises the needs of all the stakeholders in the business that you're working in. It also recognises uncertainty in the wider world. It also recognises strong vision and strong values. Now, maybe there are some lessons there for us as a country as well. But what we've got to avoid at all costs is dealing with Brexit as a single issue. Risk management by media, so to speak, is not the way to deal with Brexit, nor is dealing with it as a single issue. If we were having this conference tomorrow, we would probably be talking about how are we going to respond to the election of President Trump or Clinton. Let's set up a task force to see what the implications of that might be. Let's go back to first principles. Risk management principles say, look at your business goals, look at your key processes across the piece, and look at risk in that context. Don't do it on a single issue basis. The world is littered with examples of people who've tried to deal with risk on a single issue basis. Look at financial services and Basel II. Remember, 15 years ago? All those Basel II programs, where did they lead? One could ask the same question about Solvency II in the insurance industry. Look at Sarbox in the USA. What did that do? I would argue that looking at single issues never actually resolves the issue that you're trying to deal with. You've got to look at risk holistically across the piece, and that includes Brexit.
Thank you. William?
Very wise words. Very wise words indeed. I think the key thing is that the effects of Brexit are going to be with us way after the event occurs in 2019. That's why I say it's a process rather than an event. And for people in the financial services sector, it strikes me that what you don't want is sort of two changes in regulatory structure immediately after each other. And so that's why I think it's really important at this stage that the business community argues strongly in favour of a transitional arrangement to take us out of the EU, whilst that long-term final version of a trade and cooperation agreement is being negotiated, because it will take time. It could take several years once we're out. Within business, I think strategic planning is critical. Having a good team that you can delegate key tasks of that plan is very, very important. And the team works together to deliver the goal, which is having the best environment to invest in Britain and in your other markets, to get the best talent you can get, and ensuring that we remain open as a society to the best talent from wherever in the world it comes, and ensuring that your goods and services can be traded with as few impediments as possible amongst the widest range of global markets. I think that's got to be the strategy about how you take this process that will be Brexit into your investment and strategic plans for the decade ahead.
Bill?
Well, I think Noel is absolutely right that it's not the role of business necessarily to do politics. However, I think business is naive, and I'm sure you're not, Noel, if it doesn't understand that it is impacted upon by the wider cultural mood. And that cultural mood is understood by a large number of people who do politics to be, some describe it as a culture of fear, some describe it as a culture of uncertainty, others describe it as a dystopian age where everything we do is seen to be problematic and damaging the planet or damaging ourselves. And we need to understand how that mood came about if we're going to turn it around both for the culture and for business. Business could actually achieve a lot more in a society that was more optimistic, more ambitious, more focused on innovation, than protecting itself with financial planning. And I think in that regard, I think to some extent risk management is part of the problem sometimes, not always the solution. Risk management has become a way whereby many businesses hide away from their values and principles and just say, well, the numbers tell us that we must act in such and such a way. Actually, numbers don't speak, but what you're doing is avoiding having a more principled debate. I'll just finish on this. America, the United States, is famously captured as the land of the free, not the land of the safe, not the land of the better off, but the land of the free. And the land of the free captured the imagination, not just of Americans, but of people all over the world. From that freedom comes success in business. It's not the other way around. It's not by protecting your... And I think there's a mistake made when people say our primary duty is to protect people. Your primary duty ought to be to inspire people. Inspired and engaged people are much better for your business. And therefore, business does need to worry about shaping the cultural mood.
Okay, very good. Noel?
Well, certainly I agree. I mean, one of any good risk manager manages a whole basket of risks, and engagement risk and cultural risk is certainly one of the many risks that we discuss in our corporation. So I'm not suggesting that we have a disengaged board that isn't viewing the outside planet. What I'm talking about is the particular topic of today, which is the Brexit deck that has been dealt to us right now, and what we as risk managers need to be doing about it. So I think there are a whole range of very interesting cultural issues going on, not only here, but in the United States and the rest of the world, that any good risk manager needs to be aware of and bring to the attention of his board. I'm not sure that any of them play into the specific dynamic of what we need to be doing now about Brexit. So my takeaway is, I appreciate the political conversation that's been had. It's certainly something worth noting. I would encourage you to think about how that might play into the risks that you're evaluating in terms of this particular problem, which is Brexit. But I implore you to govern it and risk manage it appropriately as a project. I fully believe that that's what you owe your companies at the moment.
Okay, Craig?
There's a day. My life has been spent in the media or dealing with the media, and the situation in the media is often everything's reduced to binary. It's black or white, up or down, left or right. And I think we've heard a little bit of that today. We've heard about, practical versus emotional, what is the right thing to do, what's the wrong thing to do, enemies versus heroes, that kind of champions, that kind of thing. And the reality is it's a bit more complicated than that. There is a rational approach which you do need to take. I would say wait, like Rumsfeld said, for the known unknowns and the unknown unknowns to reveal themselves. Establish those facts, act accordingly, do it in a sensible, rational way, that, as Noel says. I would also say that actually, Bill, we probably agree more than you think in that the truth is we do live in a very emotional environment where people, and those are perfectly valid feelings, if you feel betrayed, lost, that the political class has done something against you, that you're not being listened to, that is a perfectly valuable thing. And if business and politics doesn't understand that or seek ways to try and address that, then that will be a problem. So yes, there's a practical approach, which I think Noel's absolutely 100% right about. You've just got to set it in those terms. But I think it would be wrong if businesses in this room were not trying to think, how did we get to this cultural situation? What are we dealing with? Why don't we have the trust of large groups of people? And that is an issue too. So rational and emotional.
Okay, anyone else care to share a takeaway? I think we're going to have the opportunity here during the networking break to interact with all of our panelists. Looking at what everyone has shared here, there were a couple of things that really stood out. One is the challenge of building trust, and maybe that's something that you almost need to go back and take a look at as well, where there is serious distrust in institutions, whether it's large corporations, banking, or government. And what can you do to better build trust in your bank or in your company with both your employees and engage them and inspire them, and with your customers and prospective customers. I really like the point here about establishing at least one or two clear principles to guide you through this uncertainty that was brought up here by our representative from Zurich. And there was a principle that was established that Zurich will stay in the UK. That gives people something to hold on to during a period of uncertainty. The idea of cultural conformity, I don't know how many times I hear from CEOs that we're looking for innovation, diversity, and so on and so on. Innovation comes from people who think differently. It's almost, and it is certainly a challenge inside our companies not to get caught up in it. And those of you who are compliance officers know how damaging that can be if the conformity is towards breaking the rules rather than following the rules. So I think all of these are valid challenges for us to take back into our companies. But thank you very much to all of our panelists. I don't think I quite needed my Kevlar vest, so thank you for that as well. And let's go out, and I know you'll be able to meet and speak to all of our panelists out here during the networking break. Thank you. Yeah.